Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Davis. I arrived a little late this morning, flying in from the States, so I wasn't around for the introductions, but my information is in your packet. And I'm extremely happy and grateful to be here with you all today, and extremely grateful and happy to be moderating this panel and not speaking on this panel, because, for many reasons I'm sure you can imagine, but also because it had been a few years since I had followed the incomparable Cheryl Dorsey speaking, and I feel like a complete idiot right now, more than usual. So I'm glad. I'm going to try to speak as little as possible and hopefully just ask questions and advance the conversation. But why don't I start with asking the panelists to introduce yourselves or reintroduce yourselves. I know many of you have been here already, and maybe any quick initial reactions to Cheryl's wonderful, I think, and incredibly insightful and detailed, and in fact encyclopedic remarks.
Well, to your point, I feel like you should start down there. I'm Stephanie Dodson. I'm with the Draper Kaplan Foundation. We fund early stage organizations, by which we mean, very generally speaking, post-pilot, pre-scale, under 5 years old, under $1 million. We're looking for also leadership that we really believe in, who are addressing a really big problem with a lever that we think they are pulling that will change the conversation in some important way. We are very interested in scale, but scale could be down or around, or we're looking at that much more broadly than we used to. My reaction to Cheryl, besides furiously taking notes, was what she said. And I think we are follow-on funders to Echoing Green, but we're also follow-on practitioners. We learn a tremendous amount from what they do and try to imitate a lot of it.
So I'm Brittany Boettcher. I'm with the Skoll Foundation, and I focus primarily on the sourcing and selection of our Skoll awardees. So working both partners where we're finding like Draper, Kaplan, Echoing Green. We're a little bit further downstream. So we're looking for mezzanine stage organizations, typically over 3 years of a track record. I'd say closer to 10 is probably the sweet spot. Over $1.5 million annual budget. Looking for organizations and social entrepreneurs that are really poised for large-scale change. So just from Echoing Green to Draper Kaplan to the Skoll Foundation's trajectory of some of the Skoll awardees in our portfolio. After Cheryl's talk, I feel like we are learning in this journey around diversity and inclusion. This year, we've made a lot of changes over the last few years, and this year I think we're starting to see that both within the incoming Skoll awardees, that 5 out of the 6 are women this year. We knew with a goal of 50%, we were never going to get there, so we upped our internal goal of 75% of all incoming awardees being women, and we even, we exceeded that for the year. And I just think it's so important to work more closely and learn from what Echoing Green is doing. They're sitting on one of the biggest data sets in social entrepreneurship. And if we're not working together from the early stages of social entrepreneurship, then it just continues to be a field that is not diverse and inclusive.
Hi everyone, my name is Pamela Roussos. I'm with the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship based at Santa Clara University, and proud to be on the stage with amazing partners. We've worked a lot with DRK, with Echoing Green, with Skoll, and to share many of the social entrepreneurs that we've worked together with. Our focus with our social entrepreneurs is helping them think about how to build sustainability and scalability into their businesses. And when we think about scalability, we think about it as broad and deep. And we kind of try to work with our entrepreneurs to be thinking about it holistically like that. Our focus, like I said, is on their business models, and that was one of the things that I was just really, again, stepping back, listening to Cheryl, is that, while we do need to be focused on the earlier today, we were talking about finances and that is an important aspect of the business, but then also being able to take care of yourself and really understanding how to do that in order to be able to then step in and do the great work that many of you are doing is really important. And so that self-care was something that I was really resonating with. So, and I love the fact that she's got so much data. I'm just, that's something that I know at Miller Center we struggle a lot with, and we're trying to get better and better at that. But just really just amazed at all the great data that you have. And as Brittany said, sitting in such an amazing data set. So that's great.
Hi, I'm Shannon Farley, founder of Fast Forward. We believe that tech accelerates impact, so we support tech nonprofits. It's an honor to be here today with so many of our partners. All of the people on this panel have suggested teams to go through our accelerator program. I'll talk about that in a second, but in addition to the accelerator program, we also run the only database of tech nonprofits in the world. We have a job board for both paid and volunteer opportunities and a summit. And we are just gotten into the business of releasing data reports, in part inspired by Echoing Green. So today, it came out in Fast Company. Our first diversity and tech nonprofit sector data report came out. And to Cheryl's points, accelerators really work. The open process allows for more diverse founders to participate in funding cycles. So for us, 84% of our portfolio are women or people of color. And it's important because when we meet them, they generally have budgets under $100,000. But we actually have a better follow-on funding rate than Y Combinator or Techstars. So last year, our teams raised $56 million in follow-on funding. And they're all nonprofits, right? So it's a different kind of capital going to a different kind of founder. The exciting news in the tech nonprofit space is that 47% of tech nonprofits are founded by women, co-founded. 30 compared to 17 in tech companies in the for-profit sector, and 30% are co-founded by a person of color, compared to 13% in the for-profit sector. And if women and people of color founders are able to cross what we call the $1 million Rubicon, like most nonprofits get stuck between $500,000 in annual revenue and $1 million in annual revenue, and if you can't get to $1 million, you cannot really get mezzanine funding. And so if women and people of color founders can cross it, they raise in near parity with white men, which was surprising to us when we went through the data. The problem is only 11% of female founders cross the Rubicon, and only 12% of people of color founders get there. So there is work to be done in this early stage to mezzanine level that I know many of us play in, but it's an honor to be here.
Great, thank you. And I know I said I was going to speak as little as possible, but I would not do justice to my founder and CEO, who is a woman social entrepreneur who founded New Profit 20 years ago and is fiercely committed to this issue, and for whom I'm really proud and happy to work for. And we, in fact, manage a women's accelerator that we created 3 or 4 years ago based on sort of our own internal analysis of our portfolio of social entrepreneurs and finding sort of underrepresentation. And one of the things that my colleagues who run that accelerator focus on is one of the themes, the frames they've started talking about is sort of access, which has been discussed quite a bit, and also agency, which also I heard in some of the earlier discussions talked about this idea about sort of supporting women to be as fearless as we know they are when they show up in seeking funding and managing their programs. Or another term I've often heard that I think is really useful and inspiring to all folks is sort of being unapologetic, right? And that's sort of one of the components I think that's included in our accelerator. So my question to you all is, and this sort of really follows on a question from the last panel, is what kinds of supports do you all provide to women entrepreneurs in your portfolios and in your work that might be either different or additional or distinctive that again folks could learn from and hopefully is responsive to the needs and interests of the entrepreneurs in your network. So, anyone want to start?
We do a lot of wraparound services for our entrepreneurs, everything from board placement on their boards to matchmaking between potential founders. I think the other thing that we do is a little bit more subversive, is that we do a lot of philanthropic advocacy trying to shame other funders into having more women and people of color in their portfolios. And I've had to be more aggressive about that in the last, we were 4 years old. I would say in the last 3 years, probably 25% of my time is in the shame advocacy.
A big part of our model is it's 3 years of funding, but also we think just as important is that we're giving 3 years of very heavy-duty support, which comes in the form of a board seat and acting as an operating partner. And my experience, I just in the last 3 years worked with 10 organizations. Interestingly, I picked a lot of women. So, yeah. And one of the things that I found very important in my support role, I mean, we do a lot of support for all of our entrepreneurs, but one of the things that I found especially important in my role with women was to play a role on their board of giving them the platform to be taken seriously. I found that a lot of these women who were the leaders was their idea. They're doing all the hard work, they're having all the success, and yet, you get a board who's really treating them like a young girl. A lot of them aren't young, And so for my role to really give them the platform by pushing back on the other board members, but not to the extent where I'm taking over that role, but I'm just clearing the pathway so that they can begin to find their own voice. And I think another thing I'll point out is that even though almost all of the organizations I selected had women leadership, they had every single one of them had male board chairs. So there's a dynamic there that really we got to break down.
And so we don't offer specific accelerator programs for women. We have 106 now organizations in our portfolio. That's a lifetime commitment to the social entrepreneur and the organization, but a 3-year initial funding. And what's interesting is part of this exploration around female entrepreneurs, what's holding, what are the barriers that's in this way to really reaching that mezzanine stage. We've conducted a lot of interviews both with early stage social entrepreneurs as well as some of the female entrepreneurs in our portfolio. And this question about the board has been really interesting because whether or not the board is actually supportive in how they view this woman in leadership actually has a really big impact on their potential to scale, and where particularly the female entrepreneurs that we interviewed in the Skoll Awards portfolio, feeling the support of their board, and when they didn't, actually getting changing things around was a really big sort of linchpin on their road to scale for them. But what was really interesting though too was how did you get in the door to some of these really pivotal moments? It was because potentially this male though that had their back was opening that door for them. Right. And so how do female entrepreneurs use those connections wisely, I guess. Right. It's just something that we're starting to learn a little bit more about.
So the support that we provide the entrepreneurs is through our mentors. So our mentors are Silicon Valley executives that have built and run companies, and as I say, all have the battle scars in their back of doing all the mistakes that we all do. And so we pair the entrepreneurs up with these mentors, and the mentors work with the entrepreneurs on a weekly basis. So the mentors accompany the entrepreneur throughout the program, and then it goes beyond the program. Programs end with us, but then many of our mentors continue to work with the entrepreneurs. Some of them have become board members. I started mentoring with the GSBI program 10 years ago before I joined the Miller Center about 4 years ago now. And I'm a board chair for one of the enterprises that I was mentoring in 2011, and I'm not the enigma. There's many of our mentors that continue to do that. And it really is about continuing to support these entrepreneurs, because our mentors love what they do. I mean, and for me, it's the best thing that I get to do. And so, and that's the way many of our mentors feel, and they want to continue to support these entrepreneurs and help them be successful. And so I think that that's an important piece that we're all bringing up, which is that continued support and having their back.
Marco, can I just do two
course.
quick resources, and Min or I are happy to connect you. This part about board governance is so critical. About 5 years ago, our colleague Kate Hayes at Equity Green started an experiential board training program called Direct Impact. Recognized about 80% of the boards, especially in the nonprofit sector, are men, white men. Less than 20% are under 40. Just crazy tough. Like we've got to fix this. And so she has developed. It was a pretty intensive training program. She's now sort of figured out a way to shorten the training, but also make it intense. Overrepresented in terms of young women leaders and people of color. So a majority of folks who go through this training now, and then we're placing them on the boards of our fellows organization. Over time, we need to open that up. Kate does have an article she wrote for Stanford Social Innovation Review about how do you diversify your board. We're happy to send it to this group because it was a really good article. But this is the work that all of us have to do. And then the question of, I was with last week because I'm doing a training program with one of our alums, this incredible woman, Katie Orenstein, who started the Op-Ed Project, who literally was like, it's all about the number of at-bats. And if we want to change the narrative, getting diverse voices into the public square, and she was like, if we can train 15,000 women to write op-eds, get on the page of Wall Street Journal, New York Times, we are going to change the frame completely. In the 10 years she's been at it, they have seen, I think it was like maybe 15% of the voices on these key outlets were women. It's now up to 20+%. So the numbers are moving. But it's not only getting more of us in the space, but also owning our expertise. Like I've now done the training twice, and she starts like, everybody in the room, raise your hand if you're an expert at something. And none of us raise our hand. We're like, I don't know. Right? So you're right, and just sort of that mental shift. You're like, okay, I do know something, right? And just sort of that exercise is so valuable. We've just got to do a better job at it. Yeah. And again, we can send you the link because she's now doing the trainings all over the country. They're awesome.
All right, so another question here for you all. I have a list. But to introduce it, so as a man of color, when I enter into a room, I make a series of calculations, pretty much always, right? There's sort of, I'm operating often on multiple layers. And I suspect, if not everyone in the room, many of you have seen or heard articles and discussions of late that I thought was a really brilliant articulation of this concept as it applies in the case for women of mental load. Familiar with that term, everybody, right? Many of you are. If not, you'll hear in a minute. So it essentially was described. Does anybody want to do that before I even try it?
Go for it. We have faith in you, man.
So, and again, so the way I sort of approached it was sort of thinking through my own experience, again, as I mentioned, where there are additional, in my case, again, speaking for myself, in my case, there are additional calculations, there are additional issues, concepts, approaches, right? How am I perceived? What is sort of the greater implication of my presence and how I show up, right? And how I speak and how I act and the things I do, because people may be making judgments that I have to account for. I have to think about that on top of simply just trying to represent my perspective and point of view as an individual, right? I sort of carry, in many cases, sort of my entire identity, race and ethnicity to the table, right? This was applied in an article I saw sort of that was describing a series of cartoons that had been written that sort of described in a family situation, in a heterosexual couple, with children. The description was sort of that there were all these extra activities and extra considerations that in that case in the cartoon that the woman had to account for within the relationship that the man never had to worry about, right? That it sort of, the very short explanation is it describes a dinner party where a guest comes over and the author, I think it was sort of preparing dinner and everything, and the husband wasn't doing anything. And then she finished, and the partner was like, "Oh, you didn't ask for help." And she's like, "Why do I have to ask you for help? You see the dinner is being made." It has to be sort of on her mind all the time. All of which was a way too long introduction to sort of say, to ask, how do you think that might or might not show up in the case in the workplace for women, or in the sector, I should say, for women social entrepreneurs? And is there a component to that perhaps that might be around the point you alluded to, Pamela, about self-care and about balance, about figuring out sort of how to navigate all those pieces that in many ways are incredibly unjust and that have to be, until we can further fix the situation, have to be accounted for in the work that social entrepreneurs are doing. Any thoughts or reactions to that?
You know, I would say I was reflecting on some conversation earlier about coming out of the gate faster with, I forget what we were talking about, but it made me reflect about how valuable it is for women to come out of the gate strong instead of try to build that on top later. And that one of the ways in which women can relieve the load is by being really bold right up front and getting their allies around them to help them be bold, so that they're not trying to back into it after they've got a board that's being really patronizing to them and funders that are patting them on the head. And you know, I've got very particular pictures in my mind of a couple of the organizations I work with. One who, if any of you have come across Nancy Loveland, is truly a fierce leader, and she goes out to funders, and you know, people say, oh yeah, but she's so networked and everything. Well, guess what? She got herself networked by, from the very beginning, just being really brave about it. And she goes to funders and says, I'm raising around, it's $5 million if you want in. No, you may not tell me what to do with that money, because you don't ask Twitter, like, you know, and people will say, can I give you 1 million? No, my round is 5. So she's learned how to really put herself out there, and people respond. I mean, they call her things that they wouldn't call men things, but she gets the money, she gets the, as opposed to another woman that I spent the last 3 years working with who was growing into her leadership, and the baggage she had to pull along with her about the perceptions people had about her capabilities, which were not at all reflective of what she really was. That was like a heavy, heavy load to be dragging behind her, and I always wished that she had had that support earlier on to help her re-envision herself. Yeah.
And I think something that we've done a little bit different in trying to understand like how we are looking for potential candidates for the Skoll Award is somebody shared research with me a few years ago around the way in which women actually communicate their vision is very different than how men communicate their, I think this is Kathy who maybe actually shared this with me too. But yeah, just the way in which women communicate their vision and what they're shooting for is very different in how men communicate that. We're looking for social entrepreneurs that are on this trajectory, have a big, big vision for scaling their impact. If that's not coming across, it doesn't seem like it's a good fit for our program. But right on the surface, and so what we've actually done though is kind of recognizing that internally, that if a woman asks for a meeting, like, we take that meeting. And if it's to better understand, like, what is actually in the data that is constituting this vision. Because women will not, what this research said, women will base their projections more in reality to compensate for a perceived lack of competence as a leader. And that's part of that mental load, right? You're always overcompensating because it's just like, well, I gotta be perfect because any wrong move and then I am judged and it will impact my business, right? And so really trying to dig in more with women leaders. So what is your vision? Tell me about it. And offering the permission to go big.
We do a similar thing with narrative budgeting. We find our male founders predict a hockey stick from day one before they've built anything.
This is what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Our women founders, people of color founders don't. And so we do a training that lasts the full 3 months. We see their first financial projections, and then we get them to a point where you have to fake the hockey stick. Even if it doesn't feel real, here's how your budget is the narrative about who you will become. And this is how the numbers match. This is the return on investment matches up with it. It's much harder for one, they all think they can't use Excel, which blows my mind because they've built these tech products. And so it's takes them longer to get there, but yeah, I think it's an important part. And those of us who evaluate budgets on a regular basis, understanding like what the narrative was that got to the particular budget that you're looking at is really important, because probably nobody, if you haven't been in an accelerator program, I think, like, unless no one has really talked about the sort of that piece of the pitch.
Yeah, I think that, building the narrative from the budget, I think is an important piece, which is feeling comfortable about, what the story is, but then also putting it out there and realizing that maybe, getting support from others to hear that that's not really the right story that you want to be told. And I'm just remembering working with some social entrepreneurs, and they were going to be pitching the next day, and there was a woman that was doing a dry run, and she said, I'm going to be doing this and this and this with the funding, and I'm looking for $300,000. And a couple of the male social entrepreneurs in the room said, I'm going to change the name. Kate, that sounds like you need a whole lot more money than $300,000. And she goes, well, yeah, I really need $1 million. But they were like, why don't you just ask for it? Ask for it, And so being able to get that support from male, friends, and saying, you need $1 million, so go get $1 million and ask for the $1 million and tell them you've done the homework, what's that?
Ask for
You
two.
need one.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. And so getting that support also from other friends and fellow journeyings, and getting that confidence. And she's done her homework. She knew she actually needed that $1 million, but she didn't feel comfortable with that.
I do, just jump in more to say, one role that I think funders and board members can be playing is, it is sometimes, not everybody is comfortable asking for money, help ask. Open the door, go to the meeting, finish the close. We have permission to do that in a way that I think a lot of times it's harder for leaders of organizations to do.
And the only thing I would add is this is where certain cohorts matter, and sort of peer-to-peer networks. And we see, everything we do is about not just the individual leader, but the cohort, right? And each one teach when you pull one along.
Yeah.
Technology helps.
Yeah.
Slack channels are like blowing up at Equity, where people are like, hey, I heard about this funder.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a call for you. Let's get on the phone. Like, so it's amazing how you can
totally.
enable sort of these peer networks that really work for women founders. Really helpful.
Yeah.